Dean Baquet, the editor of the New York Times, made a very interesting admission this week. And the admission came in the context of an emergency meeting that Dean Baquet had convened with the staff of the New York Times, who were in something of a revolt because they feel, and I'm not kidding, their big complaint at this juncture is that the New York Times is insufficiently antagonistic toward Trump. So a vocal faction of New York Times reporters, editors, and other staff apparently feel that the New York Times has gone easy on Trump and that they need to refashion their coverage to be more head-on and adversarial. Now, the fact that that would be the complaint raised by New York Times staffers about the editorial direction of the newspaper gives you some insight into how ideologically siloed those people are if they truly feel, earnestly, that the New York Times is somehow surreptitiously helping Trump, or to give it a more charitable explanation, is willing to overlook some of Trump's more egregious actions, then I don't know almost how to even react to that. Because the New York Times, far from going soft on Trump, has actually departed from many of its long-standing customs as to how it covers the presidency in its coverage of Donald Trump, because they view him overall as an existential threat. So a lot of the pseudo-objectivity that used to be a feature of New York Times coverage, where they would use euphemisms or they wouldn't directly characterize certain events or actions in a negative light, a lot of those customs have actually gone out the window since 2016. Not just at the New York Times, but in other precincts in the media that in the past had been regarded as objective. Now, they were never really quite objective, and that was always something of a pretense. But in the past couple of years, a lot of these outlets have kind of done away with the pretense of objectivity. I mean, you have New York Times reporters and columnists, but reporters in particular, because that's more significant, who do not hide their antipathy to Trump. And you might argue that's actually a decent development, because the whole dogma of objectivity was a farce from the outset. So if a reporter feels a certain way about Trump or any other political figure, why should they conceal that belief and thereby cause suspicion in their readership, who feel that they're not being told the full story about the political inclinations of the reporter who's ostensibly giving them information? But anyway, the list of examples of the ways in which the New York Times is aggressively antagonistic toward Trump are almost too multitudinous to list. But it tells you something, that the people now causing internal dissension within the New York Times have this view that the New York Times needs to be more loudly and explicitly hostile toward Trump, as if that already was not the case by many, many orders of magnitude. So that alone is bizarre, but another comment that Dean Baquet made I almost thought was more interesting. He basically gave an overview of the New York Times posture in the era of Trump, because the reason that this emergency meeting was convened, the crisis that supposedly had developed, was that the New York Times ran a headline after the El Paso shooting quoting Trump when Trump called for unity. Now, the New York Times in the past would simply just report what the president said and that would be seen as newsworthy unto itself, and it wouldn't be particularly controversial for them to devise a headline out of something that Obama called for or whatever George W. Bush declared, etc. Just common practice. But for Trump, it's seen as somehow legitimizing racism, I guess, to repeat what he said. Now, was Trump's call for unity in that instance a little hollow and forced and not particularly compelling? Sure, but he still called for unity. And it's a long-standing tradition of the New York Times to report what the president said. I don't really remember people complaining about that much in the past, but, I guess now we're undergoing this moral evolution in the journalism and media fields. So whatever you thought was the customary practice in the past no longer applies, and that's why these younger and more, politically engaged, let's say, New York Times people, are engaged in something of a mutiny, I should say. So that's interesting in its own right, but Dean Baquet went on to address the New York Times coverage of the Trump-Russia issue. And here's something from Dean Baquet that I thought was really interesting. Now remember, Dean Baquet is the head of the New York Times. So you could argue that Dean Baquet is the most influential person in U.S. media and arguably world media, because the U.S. is the most powerful country in the world. The New York Times is the most powerful media entity in the United States. So, you can make that argument. It's feasible. Here's what he said. In giving his overview of the kind of thematic, in terms of the themes of the Trump presidency, he addressed the Russia issue. And here's what he said. This is a really hard story. Newsrooms haven't confronted one like this since the 1960s. Let me stop there. So the fact that these people, Dean Baquet and the other editors, other reporters in comparable positions of influence, believe that the Trump-Russia story was so profoundly important that you could only find something of equivalent significance going back 50 years, that gave them special kind of vigor in pursuing this story. I'll continue. It got trickier, he says, after ... there's a transcript. I'm reading from a transcript that was posted on Slate, and some of Dean Baquet's words are apparently inaudible. So he says, after it went from being a story about whether the Trump campaign had colluded with Russia and obstruction of justice to being a more head-on story about the president's character. We built our newsroom to cover one story, he says, and we did it truly well. Okay, so what's he saying there? He's saying that the New York Times built its newsroom to cover one story in the Trump presidency, or at least one story with special intensity, and that was Trump-Russia. This is what the New York Times editor is admitting to without any apparent apprehension about how ridiculous that comes across as. Because what he's saying is the New York Times was engineered to create the impression that Trump-Russia was the biggest signature story of the era. It wasn't as though they were simply reacting to news events. They were creating news events by organizing their entire newsroom around the principle that this was the most important thing that had to be covered. Here's what he says later on. Chapter 1 of the story of Donald Trump, says Dean Baquet, not only for our newsroom, but frankly for our readers, was, did Donald Trump have untoward relationships with the Russians? And was there obstruction of justice? That was a really hard story, by the way. Let's not forget that, he says. He says, again, we set ourselves up to cover that story. So they made a conscious choice to conclude that the New York Times journalistic resources should be devoted to framing this story as the feature of Donald Trump's presidency that required the most emphasis. Chapter 1 of the story of Donald Trump, they say, was dominated by this one issue. Now, if you followed the Trump-Russia saga as it kind of developed, you'll know that the New York Times played an incredibly outsized role in furthering the narrative. There was a time in 2017 when almost every day the New York Times or the Washington Post would have some kind of bombshell scoop that created the impression that Donald Trump had this secret and collusive relationship with Russia, and those bombshells never amounted to anything. But it drove people crazy. And the New York Times itself would often be cited by the people investigating Trump-Russia, whether in Congress, whether in law enforcement, as a prime mover of the entire narrative. So there was this feedback loop phenomenon where the New York Times would report on the existence of a potential collusive relationship, and then the people charged with investigating that relationship, purportedly, in the law enforcement and political worlds, would cite the New York Times to give their investigative mission currency. And they would feed off one another. And that, according to Baquet, was a result of a conscious choice made by the New York Times to elevate this issue as the central theme of the Trump presidency. And here's what Baquet also admits, and this is incredible. Although he brags that the New York Times won 2 Pulitzer Prizes covering that story, meaning Trump-Russia, and by the way, they should give back those Pulitzer Prizes because they were absolutely unwarranted. I mean, the whole culture of prize giving among journalists I find to be obnoxious in the first place, but if there were any least deserving Pulitzer Prize that should have been rescinded or never given at all, it would be the ones that the New York Times received for covering the Trump-Russia issue, given that the entire tenor of their coverage turned out to be wrong, and catastrophically wrong at that. But here's what Baquet says. Quote, "The day Bob Mueller walked off that witness stand, 2 things happened. Our readers who want Donald Trump to go away suddenly thought, holy shit, Bob Mueller is not going to do it. And Donald Trump got a little emboldened politically, I think, because, for obvious reasons. And I think the story changed. A lot of the stuff we're talking about started to emerge like 6 or 7 weeks ago. We're a little tiny bit flat-footed," he said. I mean, that's what happens when a story looks a certain way for 2 years, right? So, Dean Baquet is now saying he's been caught flat-footed because Robert Mueller came out at his first public testimony and said nothing that vindicated the New York Times coverage of Trump-Russia for 2+ years that would justify the incredible intensity of their nonstop promotion of that issue. In fact, it undercut the entire editorial approach taken by the New York Times. And Baquet admits that he's now been caught a little tiny bit flat-footed. I mean, it's kind of a weird phrasing on his part. We're a little tiny bit flat-footed. Yeah, I think I would probably choose some different words to describe how the Mueller testimony and the conclusion overall of the Trump-Russia saga made the media promoters of that saga look. And a little tiny bit flat-footed would be probably the last phrase I would opt for. I would opt for some phrases that maybe can include some profanities and some rather harsh denunciations. But Dean Baquet apparently has only begun to reckon with the fact that the mission that he chose for his newsroom ended up in failure. And somehow it took Robert Mueller's public testimony for him to realize that failure. Although it should have been realized long before. I realized it right away, not tooting my own horn, but you'd think that the New York Times would have the foresight and the journalistic discernment to understand that what they were doing was a joke. But it took feeble old Robert Mueller coming out and barely being able to recall key facts from his own report for them to sit back and say, wow, we're a little flat-footed here. Maybe the chapter of the Donald Trump saga that we anointed was not accurate. Maybe we should have identified some other theme as the dominant narrative for the Trump presidency. Oops. Yeah, oops. We'll see if Dean Baquet and his fellow editors stay flat-footed or if their coverage will improve. I tend to doubt it. All right. Talk to you later.